Sport and activity can be a little bit dangerous, right? So let's see if we can focus on 5 environments that we might need to control a little bit when it comes to preventing injury. So I guess the first one's real obvious. We're going to be trying to control risk and prevent injury in a swimming pool environment. Why that ring is that large in comparison, I don't know. Secondly, this one here, what this is meant to represent is a sports hall. I mean, you could think about it as an indoor sporting venue, I suppose. But a sports hall, we've kind of got a netball thing going on in this particular case. We're going to look at that. Here, we're looking at what we might loosely refer to as a fitness centre. Now, before you get cheeky, realise I hand drew all of these little drawings. I'm actually really proud of them. Before you say they're rubbish or they're terrible or something, that's not bad. Look at this one, for example. We're also interested in how we can prevent injury in an outdoor artificial pitch. So think like 3G, 4G. We've set it up here. I think it appears here to be like a 5-a-side type of environment, like a little cage type of environment, but it could easily be a hockey pitch, for example, or other types of artificial surfaces, a rugby environment, for example. And then finally, guys, we're going to focus over here, and we're going to focus here on a playing field. Now, again, I've nominally made it a football pitch, but again, it could be a rugby pitch, it could be a lacrosse pitch, it could be all kinds of things. Now, we're going to look at these 5 environments, and one of the things I can really encourage you to do with regard to this topic area is make sure that the points I now make about preventing injury, you can relate to a range of these. I'll try and make that super clear for you, but let's go through this. I'm interested in the prevention of injury. Okay, so with that in mind, what do we understand by the main components, the main behaviours, the main actions we can take? Now, a term that is particularly well known at the moment, because I record this video during the COVID crisis, but is the concept of PPE. Remind yourself, that means personal protective equipment. Now, of course, I'm not talking about in a medical context here, I'm talking about in the sporting context. So think about, for example, when a helmet might be necessary, for example. Would a helmet be necessary in any of these environments? Well, if we were playing gridiron American football on this pitch, I suppose it could be. If we were playing something which included those kind of things, a helmet might be necessary, okay? But perhaps more importantly, we might be talking about things like a gum shield. Maybe start to consider other possibilities, things like padding. Now, can you consider now some environments where padding might be relevant in these different environments? Well, let's take our netball. What about I guess it's not personal equipment, but what about padding around these posts, for example? Could well be. What about the ground on the outside of this treadmill being nice and soft and cushioned as much as one can be? Full of a treadmill is going to hurt, let's be honest, but maybe it could be cushioned. What about things like shin pads in sports like football, for example? I've got that example twice, actually. What about things like a gum shield in rugby, in lacrosse? Could be even in basketball. I've seen many basketball players wear gum shields, for example, could be taking place here. So we're talking about personal protective equipment. I'm going to specifically talk about shin guards. I think that's a real nice one. Again, if you participate in a sport where padding is more prevalent, you can do that. And then, guys, I'm also going to mention gloves. Okay, now gloves would be relevant here for a couple of reasons, but gloves might be a hockey player on this artificial surface. They might be wearing gloves to protect their knuckles, for example, might be a relevant one. What about gloves for wrapping your fingers around this dumbbell, for example? Maybe that would be an example of where we might use it here. So that kind of spans a little bit onto what I'm going to talk about next. So we kind of sort of crossed over a boundary here, but I also want to talk to you about clothing and footwear. Okay, so clothing and footwear, and these are ones that are really quite obvious, I think. So clothing and footwear. What about something like studs? What about something like spikes? What about these are all shoes examples. What about things like Astro Trainers? Again, these are really critical about where these would be worn. You know, Astro Trainers obviously on the Astro pitch, studs on here, possibly spikes on here if it was like a cross-country type environment, maybe not so much on the playing field. Like the footwear in here, I mean, in terms of the gym and the treadmill, you could be talking about trainers being the specific type for the athlete. For example, you know, that they position the ankle correctly. But let's also think about the clothing aspect of this, okay? What about we want to wear clothing which is what we call wicking? Okay, by wicking, we're talking about like technical clothing which removes sweat from the surface of the skin and moves it away from the body to prevent one from getting cold. I was going to say, by the way, one over here, just thinking one over here for personal protective equipment. What about towel? What about goggles in swimming? Okay, could we put those in there as well? But we've got wicking clothing, taking sweat away from the body. That could be really important. For example, when we're in that sports hall environment, for example. And of course, if we're outdoors and it's cold, we play a lot of winter sports in the UK, for example, we might want to think about layers when we're here, beanie hats, gloves to protect from the cold. This kind of thing may become relevant. Now, I want to move this on. I want us to talk now about the level of competition, because it's not just what we wear or equipment we use. We also want the level of competition to be right to ensure that injury is as infrequent or as unlikely as possible. So what do we mean by that? Well, we could be talking about competition which is age related. Okay, so you guys, if you're sort of 15, 16-year-olds, you've probably played in like junior sport, I would imagine, quite a lot of you. And if you think about, we use the example of football here, but if we suddenly had like a rugby post on here, this seems all of a sudden very relevant, right? This age-related component. We might find that also, you might have certain periods of time in the swimming pool where it's kind of like fun splash sessions, or it's lane swimming, for example. Age-related in the fitness center, we don't want young people in here, not least because things like weightlifting can actually be contraindicating or negative for young people, and equipment can be quite technical. So we've got level of competition or age relations important. Now we also have competition which is performance related. Okay, now what we mean by that is you might find that depending on a performer's particular level at a particular time, they might be playing first team, second team, third team, that of course becomes relevant. Now what about if we use something like a soft ball? What about if this environment here was being used for indoor cricket, or this was being used for outdoor cricket, for example? We depending on the competition level, we may well use a softened ball rather than a hard leather and cork cricket ball, for example. These are good examples of what we might do. And finally, guys, we may also find that we change the version of the sport, so version of sport. Or what about something like we might have different numbers of performers in a team. We might find that the height or the length of things changes, for example. So let's imagine we are doing a basketball session for younger kids, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, for example, indoors in the sports hall. We may well find that in that environment we use lowered nets, say. Okay, that would be an example. Or if we've got younger children and we're doing sort of astro work, we may have more sort of small-sided environments to encourage safety. 2 things to finish off with from me. I'm going to use nice vibrant red for this one. I promise it's not to illustrate any kind of blood or danger, but I want to, that's an L and an I, by the way. Lifting and carrying. Okay, we need to get lifting and carrying right. And what do we mean by this? Well, think about times where things like equipment has to be carried. This might be things like posts, goals. Okay, so think about our outdoor environments here. If these goals need to be lifted into place, this one here and this one here, or even these rugby posts here need to be lifted into place, then of course that needs to be done correctly and by people who know how to do that. Think about the specifics of lifting in certain sports. What about lifting in rugby in a line out? If you're not sure what that is, Google it, okay? Lifting in rugby line out, all right? We want that to be done sensibly and correctly. We want to be really careful with weight-bearing experiences. Okay, weight-bearing experiences, especially if it's to do with children or elderly people. But what about weight-bearing in something like a rugby scrum? Okay, we want to make sure that people can lift and carry that weight effectively through good technique. In other words, we don't introduce it too early. And finally, guys, a super obvious point, but we want all of our athletes to do warm-up and cool down. Now that's a great one to get yourself a little cheeky mark in the exam. Always try and mention this. Warm up and cool down in all of our environments should be compulsory. It should minimize soft tissue injury. Okay, so we want it to minimize soft tissue injury, and also warm up allows for what you might call psychological prep. All right, so it can be really good to focus the performer in. Now, I just want to come back up here. What about personal protective equipment in here? Well, here's an example. We've got the ring. We've got other things. We'd have equipment on the wall and so on. All right, so there we go. Prevention of injury.